Welcome to our series Together, a study in 1 Corinthians. We invite you to join us in exploring Christianity, community, sexuality, freedom, love, and forgiveness. There is far more joy and encouragement by facing the challenges of following Jesus together. We hope you will fill out a Connect card on our app or on the website so your journey with Jesus happens in His community.
Morning. Good to see everybody here. Let's give our online crowd a welcoming. We're glad you're here. Just put it in your chat right now that you'd like to be here, but you're not here, but you are there. So that's good. In your slippers and drinking your coffee on your couch. Anyway, glad you're all here. We're in this series, 1 Corinthians. I got a question I want to start out with. How many of you have a driver's license? Okay. Most of you. How many consider yourself a good driver? How many of you would say when you're on the road, everyone around you is a bad driver? All right. Oh, man. This is a picture of driving in downtown Chatham on Friday afternoon. About 2 o'clock, I think I just stopped the truck and took a picture. We have rules for the road, don't we, in this culture of ours in our United States of America? I mean, there's a certain side you drive on, and you don't cross the yellow lines, and unless you have to, and we have all these rules, signal before you turn, and you go to some cities and it's like they have a whole new set of rules, right? Like if you drive around Atlanta or someplace like that, is this the Speedway? Is this Talladega? Is this someplace? And so, we have rules for the road in our nation, and for the most part, most places we go, most of those rules are pretty well followed. But if you go to another country, another culture, they have different rules. This is downtown traffic in Delhi, India. I went there in 2000 on a mission trip, and they have completely different set of rules. Way different. It's basically do what you have to get to your destination, whatever it is, right? And so, you know what the most important piece of equipment is on your vehicle in India? The horn, right. Some of you have been out of the country. You know what I'm talking about. Or you've driven through New York. And so, we have this, we have a different culture, and in this different culture, we have a total different set of rules, a whole new set of rules. On that mission trip in India, we got stuck in a traffic jam, looked similar to this one, and we had two armed guards on our bus because Christians were being persecuted then as they are now. And so anyway, these guys had these two old shotguns. I mean, they were really these old school looking shotguns. They're really cool, antiques. They weren't loaded. I doubt if they even know how to use them. But they were intimidating, and they got off the bus in the middle of the traffic jam. They kind of moved them around like this, and cars backed up, and we went on through. So I guess maybe the most important piece of equipment is a good shotgun. I don't know. But anyway, like different cultures, different rules. Different cultures, different rules. Many of us approach Christianity with a rule-based mindset, and it is. There are a lot of rules in our faith. We call them commandments. Sometimes we soften the word. We call them boundaries, that kind of thing. But we have rules, but there are gray areas. There are areas in our faith walk, in the culture that we live in, that aren't clearly defined, every piece of it. And some Christian brotherhoods try to define every piece of life with a rule. It doesn't necessarily have to come from the Bible. They just create them. So there are certain brotherhoods of Christianity. They have rules for mode of transportation. They have rules for dress. They have rules for the amenities in their homes. And so they have created a set of rules so everyone knows what's wrong, what's right, which side am I on? Am I on the wrong side or the right side? But those are hard groups to live in, especially if you don't agree with part of it, and it can cause a lot of conflict. And so there are places that we go and can't go in those brotherhoods, and for them, it's for that kind of person, for that kind of Christian, it's comforting to know where all the boundaries are, where all the laws are, where all the rules are. Right? I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. But if you take that brotherhood and you put them in another culture, it messes them up greatly, because these rules outside of Scripture don't work in another culture. They have different rules. And so what I want to talk about today are the gray areas in Christianity. The gray areas. Now, let me define what a gray area is. It's a morally neutral area. It's not a moral issue. It's just a gray area. So maybe in describing this, what a gray area is not will help you understand what I'm talking about. So marriage is not a gray area. One man, one woman for life, that's what God designed, and we talked about the difficulties of all that last week. And another non-gray area would be, life at conception, or sexual purity, or generosity, or forgiving our enemies. These are non-negotiables. These aren't gray areas. We clearly understand what that is about. But a gray area is a morally neutral area where Christians can have different opinions on the same topic. And so our focus today in 1 Corinthians 8 and part of chapter 10, and there we could go to several other places, is to help find some principles on how we navigate these gray areas. And so how can we live together when we strongly disagree on certain gray areas, certain topics, And so a little recap about Corinth. Corinth is a city full of idols. Most of the Roman Empire was. When the Bible, when Christianity started, it started in the first century. The world is saturated with idolatrous worship. And so animal sacrifice was part of that idolatry. And they would burn part of the portion or bathe in the blood of the animal in their idolatry worship, and then they would eat the rest of the meat, or be sold in the marketplace, or to be used in these temple banquets that we talked about last week or a couple weeks ago. And so it's a good chance, if you served hamburger helper to your family at home at night, that animal was that morning offered as a sacrifice to some pagan god. I mean, that's just how it worked. They didn't have refrigeration, and meat was scarce, and so it's a good opportunity. I mean, it was a real chance that you were eating. Anytime you ate meat, you were eating some meat that had been previously offered as a sacrifice in some pagan worship service. And so there were people in this Corinthian church that grew up in the Roman Empire and found Jesus, and they recognized that these idols and the gods behind them weren't gods at all. They weren't true at all, and they had no problem in eating meat that was sacrificed to Zeus or Aphrodite or one of the other gods. There were other Christians in this church at Corinth and in other churches that they grew up in a Jewish home. And so they grew up with a whole list of dietary laws that come from the Old Testament, from when they were established as a nation, Israel. And so they had total abstinence to anything that was remotely connected to idol worship. And then there's a third group of Christians in this Corinthian church that they had previously been sex slaves or prostitutes or temple attendants in these massive temples. And the idol worship and all the darkness that was associated with that was very near to their memories. They had been connected to that. And so you've got these three groups going to church together. I mean, they're coming together, and Paul's like, you can't divide over these things. Here are the principles. Here's how you navigate the gray areas. And for them, this was a big issue. So here's some gray areas that they dealt with: Jewish food practices, observance of religious days. That the Jews had all types of special days. Well, if you grew up in a non-Christian or non-Jewish home, you're like not paying attention to Pentecost or the Feast of Tabernacles or Passover. You're not paying attention to those things, but some of the Jewish Christians, they held those things in high honor, right? And food sacrificed to idols. And so you have to gather this in. They had these rules for over 500 years in their culture. This was so part of who they were. They were immersed. They had traditions. They had dress. They had certain pieces of silverware in their homes that were all part of these different Jewish important festival days. And so it was very part of much of their DNA. And when they become a Christian, all these things become not necessarily useless in any way, but they're not of the importance that they once were. right? And then other people in the church, they don't have any knowledge of that, and it doesn't mean much to them, those special days. Now, so that's them. What about us? What are our gray areas? Some of you are about to get real uncomfortable. I'm just going to tell you. All right. So one of those gray areas might be styles of worship music, And so I don't know if you remember this, but I remember the worship wars when we transitioned from, the hymns to a more contemporary style of worship. And then there's one of the most popular worship styles today is Gregorian chant worship, I'm like, okay, I wouldn't know how to deal with that, but I mean, there's all types of music. Do you remember the battles over which Bible translation? The KJV only group, right? I remember I was with an elder one time in a church, and the church would not go KJV only, and he left the church because he thought that was it, that the translation he had was the one. And I remember churches dividing over end times, Christians dividing over, is it when Jesus comes back, is there a millennial reign? Or when Jesus comes back, is that it? Everybody out of the pool, it's over. And so there was all that type of dialogue, and people got really, really, adamant. They'd fight over it. If you don't believe the way I believe, I'm out of here. There was creation theory debates, did God create the universe, the cosmos over millions of years, or did he do it like this and in days, and so I don't know, I wasn't there, and you weren't there either, although some of you might look like you might have been there, but anyway, aren't you glad you came? There are these debates over all these really important things, and so we have some gray areas. Here's another group of gray areas: yoga, magic literature, and holidays, right? I remember I remember reading articles and books on like how yoga was, terrible, and people were gonna, have demons fall into their head, if they practice this. But I know other people, they have Christian yoga groups, right? So magic literature. So I remember these debates. I was part of these debates because it was when Harry Potter came out. It was big in the youth culture, and my kids were reading it and all that. But there were certain Christians that said, no Harry Potter, but I'm okay with C.S. Lewis, the Narnia Chronicles, and Lord of the Rings, And so they had these boundaries, and they had rules for that, and this is how you distinguish this, and those types of things. Gray areas. Holidays. Is it Harvest Festival or Halloween? What about that one? So we have these different gray areas in our culture. Here's another grouping: entertainment, recreation, body art. So entertainment. We don't have TV in our house. We don't go to movies, like none, or just G, or PG, or PG-13 maybe, or if it's like a good topic. Like, there are all these rules, right? Everybody's got them. You guys are processing right now what I'm talking about. You probably got them in your head, and I guarantee you, within this group of people, there are different opinions on all of this. Recreation. I remember hearing a sermon by a preacher that I loved about how skydiving was a sin, that you're putting yourself at risk to die. And at that time, I had a real interest in skydiving. I was like, what? And I've never been skydiving. I don't think I do it now because recently I fell off a step stool and hurt myself badly. And so, the thought of jumping out of a perfect good airplane is not on top of my list. Body art, oh man, the debates over this, I'm so glad they're behind me. And when I was in student ministry, I had guys coming, they were 9-inch spiked, hair, different colors. They did it with toothpaste, I think most of them did, and big gauge earrings and tattoos, and they were, and I determined very early on, I was like, I don't care. Who do you know? Do you know Jesus? Like, is this the most important thing? But there were people in the church that these guys were, and they had a hard time with that. Like, they thought all this was, worshiping some pagan god, and they would point to scriptures in the Old Testament, and I understood what they were talking about, but to me it was a gray area, to them it wasn't, and people got upset about it. Another one, alcohol and tobacco use, and we can add marijuana use, or I think our state has legalized the growing of marijuana and all that. Gray areas, here they are. They're all over the place. The Bible doesn't say, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not, do this. I mean, we have to look for the principles to guide us through these gray areas. And you're thinking, no, Mom, Bob, you're not. This is for sure. Okay, really? I'm just warning anyone who goes down these tangents. You will find yourself worrying about things that aren't as important as Jesus. I'm just telling you. You got to keep the main thing the main thing. I mean, there are all types of things. You know, people get all tied up about global warming or social injustice or, you know, these things. And we're always going to have that. These topics are not going to go away. They're going to only increase. There's going to be more and more gray areas because our culture is changing. The United States that I grew up in, born in 1962, is not the culture it's not the America now. It's very much changed. My grandchildren are dealing with things I never had to deal with until I was an adult. And so what I'm saying, you know, like this COVID thing, talk about a gray area. I mean, this is not a moral issue. It is not a moral issue. There are all kinds of opinions about this. And the opinions are going to rage for years to come. There are going to be books written on what we knew and what we didn't know and what we got wrong and all to come, you know. It's all going to... And to divide over this is wrong. You shouldn't divide over... I mean, this is a gray area. And so, there's a phrase I don't like, but I'm going to use it right now to help you understand what I'm saying. This phrase, let's agree to disagree. I don't like that. Hey, let's agree to love one another, even if I have a strong differing opinion. You know, because you're not going to change me. I'm not going to change you. It doesn't matter. Let's just talk about what are the main things, all right? And so if you grew up in a very rule-based home, very rule-based Christianity, this sermon is going to be hard for you. And that's okay. It's okay to have hard things, right? It's okay to have some challenging things. But I grew up in a home where my parents played cards. We played spades and hearts and card games, all kinds of card games, you know. And then when some of my family members went to Johnson University, Johnson Bible College, they had a rule back then. I don't think it's enforcing that. You weren't allowed to have a deck of cards on campus, because cards were associated with gambling, right? And so you weren't supposed to have any cards on campus. And so when I would go down to visit my certain family member, they would close the curtains before we played spades, you know. No one to see. Don't talk about who won spades in, you know, chapel, that kind of thing. You know, it's kind of funny, but I mean, those are real issues at one time for people, right? My parents, my dad loved to play pool. And so we had a pool table in the basement, and then we had a ping pong table we throw on top of that. But I remember one time my dad and mom had invited their Sunday school class over for dinner, and there was a family that came in, and they looked in the basement, and they saw the pool table, and they turned around and left. That was it, because they grew up in a home where apparently there was some gambling in the pool hall, and pool halls were once dens of iniquity of all types, you know, and so they associated that thing like as a big deal, you know, and they didn't participate in the fellowship. So anyway, Paul gives another one here, politics, you know, that was a big issue. No, he didn't give that. I'm giving that. There are political views, Democrat, Libertarian, Republican. I don't care. Do you know Jesus? Do you know Jesus? This is the essential thing. And so some of you going like, wait a minute, I think that, okay. But let me give you the principles that Paul's going to lay out in the chapters and then wrestle with these things, okay? All right, so Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. The knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Skipping to verse 7, however, not all possess this knowledge, this so-called knowledge you have, I have. But some, through former association with idols, eat food that is easily offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. No, we are no worse off if we do eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, that person, they know there's no God and they don't care what kind of... Will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? No, he won't be. That'll become a stumbling block. He goes on to say, and so by your knowledge, this weak person has destroyed the brother for whom Christ died, thus sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak. You sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes your brother stumble, I will never eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. And so, in this, Paul is saying, hey, you who have knowledge that there are no gods behind these idols, but yet you're insisting that other people accept your opinion on this, you're going to cause those who don't have that same level of knowledge that you think you have, you're going to cause them to sin against their conscience, to actually fall into what they feel like they're sinning against them, God and themselves. And so Paul's saying right here, he's like, Paul is not elevating freedom. What is Paul elevating? He's elevating love. He's like, you can have your strong opinion about these matters, but I would rather than you elevate your knowledge, I have all this knowledge about all this topic, and I'll show you how it is. Paul's like, I'd rather you say, I have all this love. Paul's one of the smartest men that ever lived. And he elevates love over knowledge all the time. All the time. And so, our Christian behavior should elevate love, not knowledge. Should elevate love, not knowledge. And so, number one principle in the form of a question, will my behavior lead another Christian to make a destructive choice? Will what I am going to do or I'm doing cause another person to stumble? Paul will use 1 Corinthians chapter 9, the chapter that follows chapter 8. That's what they teach you in Bible college. He will use this chapter to illustrate this principle. Paul says, do not we, meaning we, he's saying, do not the apostles have the right to eat and drink? Like, yeah, we have the right to eat this food and drink this wine or whatever. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife? Paul wasn't married, but Peter was. He brought his wife on missionary journeys. Oh, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Paul's like, I don't take pay for my preaching. He could. Paul goes on to say, don't muzzle the ox, which means you have an ox treading and making grain, and you feed that ox because he's doing work, I get paid to preach. I remember one time, I was telling a guy who just come to church once or twice, and he was asking me about different things, and he goes, you mean they pay you to talk? I said, yeah, I know. Anyway, but the point is that Paul had the right to do that, but he chose not to do that because in Paul's day, there were philosophers and charlatans all over the place preaching about certain gods or things, or even those who had infiltrated the church, and they were making money off, they were making bank on that. And Paul's like, I'm going to show you, I'm going to sacrifice my position, my rights, I'm going to sacrifice what I am entitled to. There's another word. What I am entitled to so that you would see the sacrifice I make for Jesus, so that you would see Jesus. And so, by the way, how are you doing in memorizing 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter? Really, you should try. You should, even if you can't do it, just try. And so let's just throw it in our world, in our culture. Do you have the right to drink alcohol? Of course you do. Now, the Bible says don't be a drunkard, but you have the right to drink. But if you're dining with a friend or you're having a friend over who's struggling with an addiction, is that a wise decision? Could it be a stumbling block? You don't know the propensity of your kids and their possibility to addiction. Is it smart to drink in front of kids or grandkids? Like, you might want to think that through, because it might be okay for you, but is it going to be okay for them? Right? Like you gotta think about the example. Everybody in this room, news break. Everybody in this room is a mentor to someone. And everybody in this room is being mentored by someone. You may recognize that or you may not recognize that, but we're all being influenced by certain people. And so, you have to say, I'm not going to partake of this because I know this person might be struggling with that. And that's an act of love. You have knowledge. It's not a problem for you, but it might be a problem for them. And So you choose love over freedom. You choose love over your rights. Do you have the right to vent your frustrations on social media and say anything you want? Yeah, I guess so, right? But is it the right thing to do? Is that the wise thing to do? Is that the godly thing? Is that the loving thing? Could what you put on there be a stumbling block to other believers? Could be. It could be. Is anybody uncomfortable right now? See, this is what happens when you start studying the Bible. It's like, oh, wait a minute. I didn't know that sword could go right there. Yep, it sure can. It can really lay us open. And that's okay. That's okay. And so, anyway, the next principle we're going to look at is we're going to jump to chapter 10. And Paul is going to use the Old Testament Israelites as an example for a number of lessons in chapter 10. And what we have to remember is those Old Testament Israelites really struggled with idolatry. That's what brought them down. And so this is a picture of the triclinium room. This is a temple room in the pagan temples throughout the Roman Empire, especially in places like Corinth. And there were 3 couches, and in the center you were served food from the inside out. You were in a reclined position, if you recall, and the food would be brought in, and there'd be lots and lots and lots and lots of wine throughout the whole temple party. And at the very end, the sex workers and prostitutes were brought in. And so this is, when we talk about temple worship parties, this is what we're talking about in Corinth. And some people are still participating in these things to some degree, or to greater degree, lesser degree. But what Paul is saying is, he's saying technically meat's not the issue here. It's what happens. It's the environment that you're going into, or that you might be encouraging others to go into. And so, what if you go to one of these temple parties and you're leaving before the sex workers come out? You're leaving before you're intoxicated. You're just going there to hang out with some friends, some people you've known a long time, and have some good meat, and then you're taking off. Like, that's it for you. But what if somebody in the church sees you doing that and they justify their going, but they don't leave before the food turns to all kinds of immorality? What about that guy or that girl? What about them? And so here's what Paul is doing. So he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, consider the people of Israel are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar. What do I imply then? The food offered to idols is anything, or that the idol is anything? No, not at all. I imply what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I don't want you to be participants with demons. So what Paul is doing, he's associating these temple parties with the Old Testament worship, pagan worship that the Israelites participated in. The food and the drink wasn't the real issue that they had. The problem was they were going into places of demonic influence. People were being tempted in those spaces, in those places, with those people. And so Paul holds up these Old Testament Israelites. They failed to heed God's warnings, and they fell. And he's saying, don't follow in that path. Learn from the past. Know history. And you don't have to repeat the mistakes. We can learn from others. And so even though those gods don't exist, even though those pagan gods don't exist, demons do. Demons are all over the world, and they're trying to lure people into immoral and demonic activity. And so Paul's saying, food's not the issue, wine's not the issue, the presence of evil is the issue. So be very careful. And so the second question or principle that I want you to think about is, am I putting myself into a place of compromise? Technically, we have the freedom to go all kinds of places and do all kinds of things. Watch with people, watch whatever, hang out with people. I mean, technically, we're free, have the freedom to do that. But is it the wise thing to do? Could it be a place of compromise for me? Why not make a choice to eliminate the temptation before it ever happens by not going to, by having some strong boundaries in your life? So, talking about myself again, when I was a young adult, I mean, partying was it. Like, this is what we did, we drank a lot, smoked a lot, did all that kind of stuff. And not proud of it. It's just part of my life, been through that. And when, at the age of 28, when I was introduced to who Jesus was, I grew up in church and didn't know who Jesus was, but finally somebody got through this knucklehead. and I understood who Jesus was, I decided that I was going to give my life to Jesus, and I wanted to be healed. And so if I was going to be healed, I was going to follow the physician's advice, and that was I was going to not sin anymore, right? And so I walked away from all types of situations and things. I used to play bluegrass music at festivals, and dobros and banjos and those kinds of things. And behind all the stages were the parties. Beer flowed, baby. It was all over the place. And I had to give that up. I could go to those festivals now and not have. I have actually gone to those festivals and not have a problem. It won't bother me a bit. But there was a season in my life I couldn't do that. I had a buddy that drove for one of the distributor companies, and he would park the beer truck in front of his house, and we would all gather there on Sunday afternoon and watch the NFL and drink draft beer off the truck. That was just part of what we did. Part of what we did. And I was an alcoholic. Big time. And so anyway, I'm not proud of that. But what I'm saying is, when I decided to follow Jesus, I had to say no to some places and some people. And there were 3 friends very close to me that I went to them individually and I said, hey, I've given my life to Christ. And 2 of them knew what I was talking about, and they're like, man, that's a smart decision. That's a smart decision. And they kind of I explained to them I wouldn't be around. I wasn't going to hang out. And they understood. Hey, we know. By the way, Bob, we were kind of talking about you the other night. No, they didn't say that. They probably did. But I had one guy who wanted to punch me out. He grabbed me. We were going to go at it. He was so angry that I would choose Jesus over him. If you're going to follow Jesus, you're going to make some tough choices. And you better get on board. This pansy footing around, I'm just going to do things the way I already have. You surrender to Jesus, you surrender to Jesus. If you want healed, if you want to be healed, you're going to have to do what He says to do. It's the only way out. It was tough. But I knew if I didn't make some choices, some hard choices, I'd be pulled back. I couldn't go to the temple parties. You know what I mean? I couldn't hang out. And so I gave up all kinds of things. I wouldn't go in grocery stores that served alcohol. Do you know how hard it is to find a grocery store that doesn't serve beer? I couldn't walk by the beer garden. I couldn't do it. So I would buy bread at certain stores because I knew they didn't serve. Is anybody tracking with me right now? You hear me? You got to say no to get out. And so now, I can go in a pub right now that serves a great steak and have no problem. I can go to a bluegrass festival that they've got kegs everywhere, no problem. It doesn't bother me a bit. That does not bother me. I tell you what does bother me are all the steaks and all the chocolate cake that follows. That's what bothers me now, right? I'm just saying that. But you see, I had to make a decision not to put myself in a place of compromise. So I don't know what is going on in your world. I remember dealing with a guy who was struggling with porn, and he's like, I just can't stop. I said, let's take your brand new laptop outside, break it in half, and throw it in the dumpster. He said, let's do it. And that's exactly what we did. Took a $2,000 laptop, broke it in half, threw it in the dumpster. Yeah. Draw a line in the sand, crossing that. I'm just saying that, you've got to figure out what is a place of compromise in my life. If you want out, some people have real negative attitudes about all kinds of things, and negative, and they're mad at this and they're mad at that, and this isn't going right and that. Stop watching it. Stop listening to it. Stop hanging out with the people who talk about negative things all the time. Fill your mind with good things. All right. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, he says, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. If one of the unbelievers invites you to a dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions on the ground of conscience. In other words, don't ask too many questions because might not like the answers. He says, but if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, because now we're violating my conscience, right? For the sake of the one who has informed you and for the sake of conscience. And then the last question, last principle is this: can I enjoy this with a clear conscience? And so, like, so for me, I have drank alcohol since the day I walked away from it on our honeymoon cruise. We got on there's a time where you meet the captain and they serve glasses of champagne. And I drank my glass of champagne and immediately got a headache and had to go. It was just like disastrous. But my point is, like, it didn't bother my conscience 20 years later, is what I'm saying. And so our conscience is trained by Scripture. And so sometimes your conscience is look, your conscience is like your physical body. You have to train it to do things. And if our conscience is trained by Scripture, it will work through some of these difficulties. So what may have been a gray area for you then is like you've kind of worked through that. But if your conscience is conflicted, abstain. Don't do it. Don't hang out there. So let me close down. Paul says in the last of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says, I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should do. You cannot just roll through the Christian walk with Jesus and not make some tough choices. You cannot just think it's all going to happen. You've got to be intentional about, availing yourself to study. What is this thing? You've got to listen to people's stories, how they've worked out of situations, and learn principles from that. Like, we have to train ourselves to win this race. Look, before I close, if you're struggling in an area of addiction, if you're struggling in an area that is dragging you down, let's talk.
Thank you for joining us today. Please let us know how this message impacted you by filling out a Connect card on our website or app. Consider supporting this ministry by giving online.